This is one of my more favorite topics because I think when we hear the word boundary, a lot of times we think about, setting up like almost like a force field, right, between us and other people, um, or just saying no to things, which is definitely part of boundary work. But I want to give a little bit of a spin on boundary work today, as it pertains to caregiving, not necessarily as something that restrains us, but something that frees us. Okay, so I'll go ahead and introduce the source for this information that I received, and it is Jody McDonald. She practices, she's a social worker in British Columbia, so she's not in the United States. But of course, this is universal work, so it doesn't really matter what culture you're in. I think we can all benefit from this information. But she was very inspirational to me going through this work. The way that she presented boundaries, I thought was very, very applicable to the modern caregiver. And so I want to give credit where credit's due. Jody is an amazing therapist and social worker. And if you are interested in looking her up, I highly encourage you to do so. She's got some great stuff that I think we can all benefit from hearing. So that's Jody. And we'll go ahead and get into our agenda for today. We're going to talk about boundaries, obviously, right? So, what are boundaries? And what does it mean to have a boundary practice, right? Now, if you've been on any of my trainings where I talk about something being defined as a practice, it's because it's not a, one magic pill, everything's done, right? Like I do it one time and I'm fixed, or I do it one time and everything's perfect. It's something that over time you have to learn to incorporate into just your everyday life, right? So a meditation practice, a gratitude practice, boundary practice, that means it's going to take some work and some intentionality from you as the person to really get this to be kind of like a character trait that you have rather than just something you do. It's something that you are, right? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about why they're important, why boundaries are important, which I think some of it's very self-explanatory, but we're going to get into it anyway. But we're going to talk about why boundaries are important in family caregiving, right? Because there can be a lot of mixed dynamics within the caregiving role, different family members, different things that shift and change. So that's important to know why it's important to have boundaries and have that boundary practice. And then we're going to spend a lot of time in the types of boundaries, because there are different ways to do boundary work. Some ways are better than others. And then we're going to talk about some common themes in caregiving families. And then I'm going to finally wrap it up with some tips and strategies for today. So let's go ahead and hop into it. So what are boundaries? So as caregivers, there's a special relationship with boundaries, right? So when you're caring for somebody else, it's really common to find that you're putting their needs above your own, right? That's just kind of part of the job, or that is the job, right, in a lot of cases. But this can make it really tough to meet your own needs. And so that's one of the challenges that come with caregiving. And it's kind of different than everyday life, right? Because sometimes you have to put yourself to the side to care for your loved one, right? And so the way that you participate in a boundary practice may be a little different than somebody who's not in a caregiving role, because it can be a little more complicated to navigate that as a caregiver. So we're going to talk about real quick 3 common ways to think about boundaries, right? So one can be a boundary as a communication skill, right? So we can use the term boundary to describe the ability that we have to say no to others, right? So if somebody were to say to you, you really need to set boundaries with this person, what they're probably meaning is that you need to express limits, right? Like saying, no, that's enough. I can't take that on. I don't have time for this, right? And sometimes you can struggle with saying no, but that isn't necessarily a problem with your communication skills, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But most of us can find the words that we need. It's just really about finding the confidence enough to use them, right? Next, physical space. So when we think about boundaries in terms of physical space, it could be like when someone gets too close to you, right? They kind of get in your bubble. So if you think about if you're at an ATM, and somebody's kind of close to you, you may feel kind of some unease, right? That they're in your space, that they're kind of getting your personal information. And so we sense that in our bodies, right? And so that's a boundary, right? That physical space where we need somebody to back up, right? Get out of my bubble. And then lastly, we can think about boundaries as like professional boundaries or ethical practice, right? So if you were say you wouldn't call your doctor after hours, even if you had their phone number, right? You would call them during business hours, right? And so that's just kind of like that understanding of space and limits in those interactions, right? But today we're going to talk about boundaries as a way to connect with others while also honoring ourselves. So we're going to talk a lot about how kind of like always pouring from an empty cup kind of a thing, right? And boundaries can help us keep that cup full. Okay. So the boundaries we'll explore today, they're not just about saying no, they're about finding ways to say yes. Okay. Yes to yourself and to the people that you care about. Okay. So what is a boundary practice? So sometimes we can bring along patterns of relating to other people from our lives before we took on the caregiving role, right? And that can make things kind of tricky. So boundaries are really about how we connect with ourselves, okay? And it's important to ask yourself, how do you know what belongs to you and what belongs to someone else, right? And so that understanding can really come from like feelings and sensations that arise within us. Okay. So for many of us, especially when caring for others, you might find yourself losing touch with your inner self, right? Particularly when you're faced with someone whose needs are far greater than your own, right? You're just from morning till night, from sun up to sundown, your priority is the needs of another person. And so it can be very, very easy to get into a space where you don't even really know what your needs are, right? Because you're so focused on someone else's that you haven't really sat and thought about, well, what do I need? Okay. And boundary practice can really help with that. So when you're caring for someone, it's kind of like saying, I'm tuning into you to see what you need, right? And I'm going to put my energy towards helping you. But then we also have to consider turning that back onto ourselves a little bit, right? To tune into ourselves and recognize what is it that we need. And so a healthy boundary can look like I see you and I see me, right? I hear what you need, but I also hear what I need, okay? And so balancing both those perspectives is really the goal of a boundary practice. And so in caregiving, it can be incredibly easy to give a lot to others and then forget to take care of yourself, right? So it's important that we nurture ourselves too, so that we can be the best for those that we care for. And so when we want to set boundaries, we have to be able to identify our own experiences and differentiate it from another person's experience. Okay. So if someone else is frustrated or sad and we feel something in relation to what they're feeling, that's empathy, right? I feel what you're feeling. Okay. And we can feel with another person. We can feel along with them. But in a boundary practice, it means that we're able to see that what we're feeling isn't really our feelings, it's the other person's. Okay. And we're kind of feeling something about their feelings. Okay. So when someone else is sad, we might feel sad, but we're really just recalling our own experiences of sadness. Okay. Some people can take on other people's emotions as if they're their own, and they then take that sadness as and they take ownership of that sadness. And a boundary practice will help you differentiate between understanding someone's sadness and then and taking it as your own sadness. Okay, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But we can think about boundaries as a container that we create for our own feelings, our own energy, our own emotions, right? And our own essence or our selfhood. And so you can think about it like this. What happens to your sense of self if it has no container, right? If we have no ability to tune into ourselves and notice what we're feeling, especially when we might be overwhelmed or when things that we're dealing with on a daily basis are really, really challenging and sometimes feel too hard for us. What happens to that, right? If we don't have a container for ourselves, what does it look like? And so when we care for others without boundaries, we don't have a container for our own feelings. It's we can experience a lot more resentment or frustration, physical fatigue and burnout, right? Because there's no separation between how someone else feels and how we feel, right? So that can be very, very overwhelming. And so if we don't have boundaries, we're more vulnerable to what we call compassion fatigue, right? And that really just means I'm tired of caring, okay? Compassion is not a finite or is not an infinite thing, right? It can be very finite. And if you don't take time to refill yourself, it's very, very easy to fall into that compassion fatigue or that burnout space. Okay. Let's see. So any of us who've been caregivers for any amount of time can come to a place where you experience that feeling of being tired of caring. And it's really hard to experience that, especially if you are by nature a very caring and compassionate person. And then you kind of hit a wall and you're just like, I can't care anymore, right? Apathy creeps in and it feels uncomfortable. And you can even kind of feel guilty for that. Okay. But I just want you to know that that is perfectly normal. It's 100% common, right? Because we can't burn the candle at both ends, right? Without at some point, burning us out, right? And boundary practice really helps us to know when we're getting into that space, right? When we know I'm getting tired of caring, okay, and I need to course correct or I need to fill my cup a little bit, okay? Another thing that you can experience without boundaries is something called vicarious traumatization. And this word kind of comes from social work or other helping professions like nurses and things like that. But it really just means like an emotional residue that we experience because we've been exposed to traumatic stories or experiences of others through our work, right? So witnessing fear, pain, terror that other people have experienced. And so this can happen when you're caring for someone who's going through a very difficult time, a very difficult diagnosis, and you're witnessing that, right? You're experiencing what they're going through, and it's not happening to you, right? I mean, you've got your own stuff that's you're experiencing because of that, but it does have an effect on you, right? You're seeing somebody suffer, you're seeing someone have a difficulty, you're seeing somebody maybe struggle with their diagnoses or maybe their loss of skills that they used to have. And this person's probably someone you really, really care about. And so, of course, you're going to feel, you at least have the chance to feel some of that vicarious traumatization, right? Where you are traumatized because you're experiencing someone going through trauma. Okay. But this is something that almost everybody who cares for any other person in that space is going to feel. So when you care without boundaries, you're going to have less energy for your own life and your own goals and your own interests, right? Because there's just not enough of yourself in your own life. It's all about another person. And so it's, of course, very difficult to take time for yourself as a caregiver. And also, if we think about, well, the person I'm caring for is going through a lot more than what I'm going through. And so then you can kind of feel guilty for stepping away and taking that time, right? You might not see your own needs or interests as important because somebody else is just going through something, right? And that's normal. But of course, we know that in a caregiving situation, especially if it's a long-term caregiving situation, that's not sustainable, right? You cannot neglect yourself over time without taking that time to reinvest in yourself, okay? So again, why are they important? Awareness of our inside experience, which is really what boundaries are, right? Understanding when you've reached a breaking point or when you're getting close to that edge, okay? When we have that awareness inside our experience, that can help you to take better care of yourself and stay in balance, right? So that boundaries can make your caregiving sustainable. So, of course, I'm not suggesting that you take your focus away from the other person because that's essentially what caregiving is, right? Use your intelligence, your empathy, and your relationships to know what another person needs and how to care for them. But what I'm suggesting, or what I'm inviting you to consider, is it is important to remember that sometimes we also just need to check in with ourselves and see how we're doing, right? Take a breath into your body and notice how you're experiencing that moment in that day and to name it for yourself, right? And then come back to your caregiving role, right? I know that, say, mom needs this thing, right? And you are burnout or you're tired, you're experiencing compassion fatigue. I'm not saying to neglect mom and what she needs. What I'm saying is maybe put a pin in that space where you know that you need to come back around and fill your cup, right? So do what you got to do, take care of mom or whomever, but then don't just continue on, right? Find that time to loop back around and meet your own need as best as you can, okay? It's just that balance, that back and forth. So why are boundaries especially important in family caregiving? Well, because as caregivers, you're deliberately placing yourself in a position of service, and the goal is to give another person care, identify their needs, help them, right? That's what the role is. And so when the needs of the other person that you're caring for consistently exceed your own need, it makes it seem very logical to deny that need, right? But if you think about any given day in your caregiving role, the needs of the person you're caring for might be high relative to your needs. Um, And those are probably the conditions that lead you to think like, oh, I don't need to go for a walk, or I don't need to go to the bathroom if I need to go, or I don't need to sit and eat my lunch. We just kind of put our own needs off. But the problem, of course, is that you can be a wonderful, excellent caregiver and do everything right. You can have days where you don't get frustrated, where you get a lot done, you're productive, you feel like you've had your best day of caregiving, right? Um, but then you'll wake up the next morning and the needs of the other person will still be just as high, right? So even your best offering doesn't really change the situation very much. And it's not sustainable to not meet your own needs, at least some of the time, okay? Even if your needs seem not as great as the person that you're caring for. But we know, most of us, giving feels good, right? And most of us are consenting to be caregivers, right? We want to care for the person that we're caring for, but giving more than we're able to, or we wish to on any given day, day in and day out, right? That's stressful, and it creates resentment, and it can create a lot of guilt too. And it makes it really hard to keep giving, right? And that's that place where you start to feel like the role of caregiving is kind of eroding your sense of self and even your well-being, because it is, right? Um, Caregiving is based on your ability to continue to meet the needs of another person over time, even when those needs are demanding and exceed your own capacity at times, right? So it's not saying that you're going to have days where you can't meet your needs, right? But if you're doing that every day, consistently all day, that's going to become problematic fairly quickly. Okay. And I've said it a million times, and I'll say it again, that caring for yourself is caring for your loved one. The statistics are pretty scary out there when you think about how many caregivers actually pass away before the loved one that they're caring for. It's because when you start taking care of another person, you stop taking care of yourself. Okay. And you can't do that for a very long time. You can't do that sustainably. So you might not always feel like you have permission to say no or set limits, right? Um, Maybe you have respite available to you, but you feel very guilty about having your loved one go to a respite or have somebody come in so that you can go out and have a break. Especially if it feels like your loved one isn't really on board with that idea, right? Where they just want you to care for them and they don't want anybody else to come in. Um, but your guilt is going to be a lot easier for you to deal with when you have a framework for your sense of self. Okay. And later I'm going to talk a little bit about how self-compassion is really, really a lovely companion to practice boundary work. And I would say it's not even a companion to it. I feel like it's probably a necessary ingredient. Okay. That's self-compassion. Because if you don't have self-compassion, you're always going to find a reason why you don't matter. Okay. And why you don't need to take care of yourself. But right now I'm going to touch a little bit on guilt, right? Guilt is not uncommon in the caregiving world, but it is a really poor motivator to get ourselves together, right? So whenever you do something out of guilt, you're doing it to avoid the feeling of I'm bad and I've done something wrong, okay, regardless of what that is. And so you're creating a future situation of resentment, right? Guilt and resentment are the rock and the hard place of caregiving, right? And you guys probably all know that. So if we're acting from a place of guilt, we're going to lead ourselves into resentment, right? And so when we feel resentful, we might get angry, you might act out, and you don't always have those feelings towards the person that you're caring for, right? Sometimes you have those feelings towards other family members or towards the healthcare system or towards, the cashier at the grocery store because you just don't have anywhere else to dump it, right? And so when you get to that peak of resentment, then you're actually going to go back over to a sense of guilt, right? So it's kind of like, oh, I'm peak resentment, I'm acting out, and now I feel like garbage because I said something mean to the cashier at Publix or because I lashed out at the receptionist on the phone at the doctor's office, right? And so let me talk a little bit about how you can offset that back and forth through the practice of boundary work. So it is an essential skill of being in service to others to learn how to be a good steward of your own energy. Okay. So caregiving is one of those roles that we have in life where it's really challenging to be a good steward of your own energy because your own energy or a sense of yourself is challenged by the role of caregiving, right? How can I invest in myself when my loved one needs so much of me, right? Um, but you can always learn how to be a better steward of your own energy. And I like to call it my energy budget, right? There's some weeks where I've got more physical energy and more mental energy than others. And during those times, that's when I try to pack a lot of stuff in. And on the times where I know I'm going to be low energy and low compassion, I minimize things outside of what are just the basic necessities. Okay. And that's worked really, really well for me. So sometimes what's making your caregiving role more difficult is some of the patterns of relating that you had even before you were a caregiver. Okay. So this can be true, especially in family caregiving when the person you're caring for is a spouse or a parent, and there's those long established pre-existing roles or patterns of relating that may make the way that you care more difficult. And I'll go into that deeper now. So we're going to talk about the types of boundaries. Okay. So we have vague boundaries, rigid boundaries, and healthy or flexible boundaries. I think I'm about to sneeze. Nope, it's going away. Okay, so the three patterns of relating or three ways of doing boundary, okay, that is the rigid, vague, and healthy. There it is. Sorry, excuse me. Okay, so on here I've got a graphic where I've got the three states of water, okay? We've got steam, we've got liquid water, and we've got solid ice, okay? And those are representing the types of boundaries. So the steam is the vague boundaries, and the water is the flexible or healthy boundary, and the ice is the rigid boundary, okay? So we're going to focus most of our energy on patterns of vague boundaries because that's the one that usually makes you much more prone to giving all of your energy away and not keeping any for yourself, okay? Having vague boundaries makes you feel like even the idea of separating your feelings from someone else or taking space for yourself is going to make you feel guilty, okay? And it makes you feel selfish sometimes too, right? So if you're in a pattern of vague boundaries, I want to suggest that we have very little accuracy for seeing what is actually selfish, right? Because you're in a space where you're maybe just naturally like a giver, right? You're not really selfish at all. You can be very selfless. And so it makes it hard to take time for yourself without feeling guilty. Okay. It could just be your personality or the pattern of relating that you've kind of grown accustomed to over your life. So vague boundaries. Most of the structure of boundary and how we utilize boundaries, we learn early in our lives, usually with our first families, right? Our parents or siblings, whoever we grew up living with under the same roof, okay? And all of us have a dominant pattern of relating. For those of us who identify with having a lot of empathy or being a caregiver for most of your lives, before you were even official caregiver with a capital C, you might have a pattern of vague boundaries and maybe were a caregiver, emotional caregiver, physical caregiver in that space of your first family, right? And maybe you didn't even realize that that's what you were doing, okay? But in this pattern, your sense of connection to other people is so important to you. It's such an important place of emotional safety that you can forego your connection to yourself, okay? It's the idea that if you're really focused in this direction, so we put other people's needs and desires first, that we don't even really know how to relate to our own needs and desires, right? So this is kind of a good way to be sometimes, except in this pattern, you do that even when it harms you to do so, okay? It's not bad to be a giving and empathetic person. It just becomes problematic when you are constantly giving, 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 giving. Okay. You're not turning any of that compassion back onto yourself. Okay. So you might not know yourself in this style of relating, right? Because it's always about meeting the need of another person. So you might not know yourself very well, like your preferences, your needs, your feelings, because you tend to be really focused on the connection that you can make with other people by connecting to what they need, right? So sometimes maybe you do get a day to yourself or some time off, and the opportunity to kind of tune into yourself. And maybe you don't even really know what you would do with that day, right? What would you even need? You don't even know what would restore you in that space, in that style of relating, because that connection that we have with the other person is so important that you're not going to jeopardize that by focusing on yourself. Okay, so that's kind of what a vague boundary is. Okay, where it's just really how do you relate to other people and their needs? Like that is the relationship, right? I'm useful to this person, and so that's the foundation of your relationship. Okay. And so in this style of relating, you may have a lot of trouble saying no and setting limits, right? You act on behalf of others and not on your own behalf. And so you might act as though the needs of other people are more important than your own needs. And that can make you it can make you less aware of what you need over time, right? So think about it like this. Like a volume knob on your inner voice, right? The thing that tells you, I'd rather do this instead of that, okay? That's really turned down, and sometimes it can even be muted, right? So that if you do get time to tune into yourself, you might not even see the value of that. You might not even know what to do. And so that pattern of relating, it's really common to have trouble seeing or even respecting other people's boundaries, but kind of like in a nice way, right? Like in a caring or kind way. Um, and you can kind of be unbound in your care for other people because your priority is on connection, right? So it's always like, how can I be a resource? How can I meet a need for another person? And that's all you're hearing is somebody else's need, that you don't even hear the whisper of your own needs in the background. Okay. And so your priority is always going to be, how can you be of service to another person? And again, I'm not saying that's bad. Okay. But we're looking for balance. Okay. That's not sustainable to constantly pour and pour and pour. So you can also be very afraid of losing connection to another person with vague boundaries or disappointing them. Um, if you tell the truth about how you feel, or if you take space to meet your own need, right? You can kind of worry, if they don't need me, or if I'm not meeting their needs, are they still going to want to be in relationship with me? Okay. And remember, these vague boundaries are not necessarily, right now we're talking about your pattern of relating as you've grown up, as you've, lived your life before caregiving. Okay. So this may be something that was in you, part of you already. It just became exacerbated as your caregiving needs came to the forefront. Okay. So in caregiving, you see this pattern of relating where we are the person who tunes into others and gives them what they need, right? Just generally in your family. And when the needs of the person that you're caring for necessitate that you become the primary caregiver, that often means that you can't do as much as you used to do for other people, right? You can't provide or be as connected to other people. And that can be really, really hard to tell the truth about your own feelings, right? And take the space to meet your own needs. Because you're like, well, I used to do this, A, B, and C for my kids. But then I had to start taking care of my mom. And now I can't do these things for my kids. And so then when you have time to take away from mom, you're taking time away from your caregiving roles. Instead of taking that time to yourself, then you go back and try to meet the needs of your kids, right? You go back and try to do A, B, and C. Okay. So in that pattern of relating, when you notice someone else's need, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to try and meet that need because you're already, kind of at the end of your rope with this caregiving role. And then you kind of have to, you might feel as though you're neglecting another person, right? And it can be there can be a breeding ground for guilt. And you can feel very anxious, right, in that space if you're aware that someone else's needs are not being met and that you're not able to take steps to meet that need. And so this is really just about connecting with other people. Okay. It's not that you have to be helping somebody, but underlying that belief that you have to be helping somebody is that I have to do these things in order to stay connected with that person. Okay. If that makes sense. So it really is about meeting a core need of ours to be needed, right? So it can be kind of tricky. This is my last slide on vague boundaries, but this is the most common one that we see in caregivers. So that's why I'm taking more time on this one. Vague boundaries inevitably produces feelings of anger or even rage. Okay. And that can be kind of, a big flip for you if you're always, a loving, caring, kind person. And then all of a sudden you swing over into anger and rage, right? That can be very jarring to our sense of self and to our identity, right? But have you ever found yourself saying to someone, I've done this and this and this and this for you, and you can't even do this one thing for me? Right? That's what I mean by this, where you just kind of get to that point where you're just like, I have given so much and I cannot give any more, right? And that's a normal place to be. And this is why boundary practice is so important, because you don't want to get to that space, right? If you don't take care of yourself, you're going to end up in this space. Okay. It's just inevitable. Okay. None of us are Mary Poppins with this infinite amount of compassion and empathy and no need to rest or anything like that, right? So when you've been so focused on another person and not tuning into yourself, not taking care of yourself, you kind of expect that it's going to come back around to you, right? That someone's going to take care of you, but then they don't. And so then all of a sudden, you're noticing all the ways that you've been taking care of another person, and you can feel angry and justifiably so, right? Those feelings are really important. They're an authentic response to a pattern, which is essentially self abandonment, right? Because you are putting yourself on the back burner so often, you have to kind of abandon yourself in that space. Okay. But then you get angry and you can take that on other people. But really, it's ourselves that haven't been looking after ourselves, right? And that can be really hard when you care about connection with somebody, but then you hit that limit of how much you can abandon yourself, right? Noticing when you've reached your limit is actually a good thing. But then we might get angry. We might lash out at someone who's not even in that dynamic, right? And then we feel guilty again, right? And so usually come right back out with that desire to connect with other people. And so it's not really others who have failed to meet your needs most of the time. Again, it's just kind of having that mute button, or the fact that you've really been attuning yourselves to someone else and not giving it back to yourself. Okay, I'm not saying that people aren't going to disappoint you, they will, but you're less likely to get to that space of anger and resentment if you are aware of you where you need to reinvest in yourself, even if it's just a little bit. Okay, so now we're going to talk about rigid boundaries. And so rigid boundaries, there's kind of like this pendulum that swings, and we're going to get into a little bit more, but many people who have this pattern of rigid boundaries, um, sometimes you have a vague boundary style, and then you swing over into rigid boundaries when you get to that place of anger, frustration, or rage. Okay, that place of resentment. And this might be a place that you come to temporarily, but sometimes you don't really last super long here. Okay, so in a pattern of rigid boundaries, you feel a strong need to protect yourself, and you can be defensive from this place. Okay, you can be kind of apathetic from this place. You feel separate from others, and that can feel safe to you for a while, right? So this kind of boundary is more like a wall, right? um, it's kind of like saying I can maintain this sense of connection to yourself if you keep other people at a distance. Okay. So sometimes when we've been in vague boundaries, and giving all of our energy away, it can kind of feel like a relief to come to a rigid boundary space, right? Where it's kind of like, no, right? I've given, and now I'm not doing anything, right? And that can feel good, right? To say, no, I'm not doing this, right? But we fear in this state that we're going to lose our sense of connection to ourselves if we connect to other people, right? So it's this opposite space that we're in, right? And this is a state in which you don't want to talk about it, you don't want anybody to help you, and you kind of just want people to leave you alone, right? So with vague boundaries, it's kind of saying my connection with you is so important to me, I don't need to connect to myself. I'm willing to forego my connection with myself. And in rigid boundaries, it's the idea that I am connected to myself. I hear my inner voice. The volume is turned way up. But if I connect with you, I'm going to lose my sense of self. Okay. So it's kind of like a self protection, right? Where you swing from rigid and vague and rigid and vague. Okay. And that can be really exhausting. So in rigid boundaries, you say no frequently, and you can sometimes be very grumpy about it, like, hell no, I'm not doing that, right? We can say a little more forcefully than what we mean to, right? Because you've reached your limit. And you often choose rigid boundaries after having vague boundaries and getting hurt or exhausted. And then that pendulum kind of swings back and forth. So you see how they're kind of connected, right? These two states. And a lot of time, if we're giving too much in our connection to other people, then this is where we have to take our energy back. And so in a healthy boundary, each person comes about halfway, right? 50-50. But in caregiving, we know that the person that we're caring for, they can't really fully be present for us in that kind of pattern of relating. And so sometimes they may be at 20, and in order to connect with them and provide for them, we have to go to 80, right? And make sure that we're connected. And that's necessary sometimes, right? But the problem with this is that if you continue to go into 80 in this way, it means at some point you're going to have to go back to 20 just for self-preservation. Okay, so you're going to have to at some point get into that rigid boundary space just so you can have some time to reconnect with yourself. Okay, and so the goal with this information is to say we need to be aware when we're getting to that space so that we can pull back to ourselves before we end up lashing out and getting angry and setting those really rigid boundaries, because then that's when we're going to feel kind of crappy, right? We're going to feel kind of guilty for that. And then it's just this whole emotional back and forth that can be really, really exhausting. Okay. So you're either giving all of yourself, all of your care, all of your energy away, or you're in a rigid boundary and you're resentful and churlish and don't want any kind of connection, right? So there's no balance there. And so in a healthy boundary pattern, we can stay at 50% a lot more. Okay. Yes, of course, you have to meet the person where they are and go to 80 when you need to, but then you also need to come back to 50 when you can. Okay. So you can say, I know I have more to do than what I want to do right now, but when I can, I'm going to come back to this place of not overgiving. Okay. And that can allow you to stay more present. And that can be kind of exhausting, right? And difficult to go back and forth in such a wide range. So I have a graphic here. So think about it as like this line, right? This continuum um, between bond and breathing room. Okay. So everybody needs bond and everybody needs breathing room. So these are basic human needs that we all have. When we don't get enough bond, right? Whether that's a pattern in our lives, we don't feel enough connection, or just on any given day or conversation, it can give rise to feelings of abandonment, or those feelings, you can kind of feel kind of anxious in that space. And we feel like the safety would be reestablished through more connection, right? So we have that feeling of longing or wanting to be in connection with other people. But we focus a lot on bond. And so now I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but we also need breathing room, right? As a fundamental need. When we don't get enough breathing room, it can give rise to feelings of inundation or flooding or overwhelm, right? So in that state of inundation or overwhelm, we fear losing our sense of self or being consumed or overwhelmed in this state. And so safety would be space in that place, right? Um, and of course, I think caregiving is just inherently overwhelming, right? Because your role as a caregiver is essentially to provide bond to another person, right? And so you don't get enough breathing room in those roles, and it can be really hard to find breathing room, right? You have to kind of schedule it out, okay? And so again, let's talk about guilt, right? A lot of us came into the role of caregiving already with the pattern of vague boundaries, right? Where it's our role to be giving comfort and making connections through caring for other people. And then it becomes our main role to care for another person whose needs are going to exceed our own. It's very difficult to be the person who is providing bond all the time, because there's no breathing room, right? You're always caring for another person. Okay. So healthy boundaries is like, I'm fully present and you're fully present, right? But we know in caregiving, especially if it's like dementia caregiving, it's not always the case, right? So you're going to be providing bond, but it doesn't mean that you're receiving it from the person that you're caring for. Okay. Not like you used to. And so this is another reason why it's really important to kind of be attuned into yourself to see and hear ourselves in what we're doing. Okay. So breathing room is something we can provide for ourselves just by noticing how overwhelmed we are, right? Taking a breath, naming the way that you feel, telling yourself the truth about how you feel, right? And offering yourself some self-compassion. Okay. So if we are in denial about how tired and burnout we are, if we're in denial about how resentful we feel, if we're in denial about how apathetic we feel, we're not going to have the self-compassion necessary to give ourselves breathing room. Okay. So here's just a quick synopsis of what I mean. Self-compassion practice means to first notice that you're suffering. Okay. And that can be kind of tough for a lot of us, especially if you're just kind of one of those people that puts on your armor and just kind of pushes through things because you know they're going to be hard. But noticing that you're suffering can be as simple as saying like, ow, right? Oh, this is hard, right? Just noticing that something is hard for you. And I think this is where support groups can be really helpful too, because if you see other people feeling the same way that you feel, it's a lot easier for you to acknowledge that, yeah, I do feel this way, right? The second step is to meet your suffering with kindness. Okay. So you can simplify it by saying the first step is ow, and the second one is awe, right? So instead of saying, come on, get it together, get back in there, you can say to yourself, yeah, this is hard, right? And acknowledging that, you can be more kind to yourself in the face of your suffering. Okay. Even if you're doing it out of love, it's still hard, and you still deserve self-compassion when you get overwhelmed. okay? And the third thing, it's very important, especially in caregiving, is the idea of locating your experience, your moment of suffering in common humanity. Okay, this is a key component to self-compassion. Okay, so that means, um, like I said before, support groups, right? Seeing other people experience what you experience, feeling what you're experiencing, thinking the way you're thinking, you realize, wow, anybody in this role would feel the way that I feel. Okay. And so if you see yourself in common humanity, then you don't feel so weird for feeling the way you feel, right? This is normal to feel this way. And when we normalize how we feel, then we can be more compassionate and say, of course, I feel this way. It's normal that I feel this way. And it's okay to find ways to alleviate my own suffering by getting that rest, that respite, that break that we need, right? Pouring back into yourself. So healthy, flexible boundaries. So we went over vague boundaries, we went over rigid boundaries. So what does a healthy or flexible boundary look like? It means that you can connect to someone else while also staying connected to yourself, right? That's the difference. That you are not so overrun and overwhelmed with another person and what they're going through that you lose sight of who you are and what you're experiencing, what you need. Okay. It says you can be connected to someone else and also be connected to yourself. You can see and hear another person, and you can see and hear yourself to know what you need, what you want, what you feel. Okay. And that's what I mean when I say self attunement. Okay. That you're not drowning in somebody else's stuff to where you can't even hear your own voice. Okay. And so separating your feelings from another person's feelings, you still feel empathy in that space, right? But you're not taking ownership of their feelings. You're acknowledging them, you're understanding them, you can put yourself in their shoes, right? But you can also give yourself the separation you need to also be able to say, what do I need? What am I suffering through? Okay. Let's see here. So the idea that something is happening outside of your boundary that causes some feeling inside of your boundary, but those things are actually separate, right? So you have your boundary of who you are, your container of your energy, and something going on outside of that container is affecting you, but you don't have to bring it into your boundary and make it part of who you are. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. So we're going to go quickly because I'm running out of time here. Themes in caregiving families, okay? So there are some very common themes that can be very complicated and difficult themes sometimes, but they can be met with boundary practice. So I've already mentioned the first one, which is sometimes the primary caregiver, you have a pattern of vague boundaries with the loved one that you're caring for, the care receiver, from before your caregiving began. So spouses, especially, parents, especially, right? Siblings, even, right? So if you recognize yourself in a pattern of vague boundaries, right, where it's always about the other person and never about yourself, you're going to get really hammered as a caregiver, right? Because then there's no limit, right? There's no limit that you've given of somebody to given to somebody to say, I can only do this much, right? I can give up to this point, okay? And so when there's no limit to your sense of energy and what you need to give to somebody else, then you're going to be emptied really quick, okay? So of course, I'm not suggesting in any way that you stop caring for another person, okay? It's just about adding a little bit more care to yourself, okay? That's the boundary practice, okay? It's just simple, subtle inner shift, but it can bring you back into your own life a little bit more so that you can take better care of yourself, okay? So caregivers are already having vague boundaries in a sense. And then you get into that caregiving role, and all of a sudden the needs are very high every day. That vague boundary pattern is going to be very hard to maintain. Okay. And so we don't want to switch from vague to rigid, vague to rigid. Okay. We want to have those healthy ones. The second theme that we notice that's really important is that the care receiver may have more rigid boundaries or experience higher overwhelm or inundation. And you can feel that inundation feeling sometimes, even in response to someone else's good intentions. Okay. So, like when your care recipient has more of a pattern of rigid boundaries and they don't want to connect, they would rather connect with themselves, and they can be grumpy and a little rigid about that. It makes the experience of being cared for more difficult, right? And it can make the experience that you have as a caregiver more difficult, right? And it's a very common pattern, even in relationships, where someone who needs more breathing room is in a relationship with someone who needs more bond, and then it just kind of goes back and forth, right? Somebody's needs may be a little bit higher than another person, even outside of caregiving, and that can be tricky to navigate that. Um, but caregiving, again, by definition, is a little overwhelming or inundation for the person being cared for, right? Sometimes they have a high need for bond, and that can feel really overwhelming for you as the caregiver, right? But the reverse can also be true. And that caregiver can be very comfortable giving a lot of bond, but the care recipient feels overwhelmed by that. And it can be a very challenging dynamic because it also makes it hard for you to feel like what you're doing is valuable and welcome, right? If you're caring for somebody who has more rigid boundaries, but the diagnosis requires that you kind of invade that space on a regular basis, that can be very challenging for them. Okay. And if you're kind of one of those people where it's like, let me do it, let me help you, let me care, let me bond, and then they say no, that can kind of hurt too, right? Another theme, when an adult sibling or an adult child is a caregiver for a parent, or it can be true even if there's a spouse caregiver. There might be this dynamic that takes place where maybe geographically one of the adult children lives closer to their parent than the other siblings. And of course, there's going to be conflict that arises, and that's very common, right? Um, but it's not actually because of the caregiving itself, but maybe those underlying patterns of relating, right? And so that can mean that we connect with other people by providing bond. When we perceive that our sibling is providing bond for a parent more than we can feel kind of outside of that. Or a lot of the time, the other siblings can be critical of the caregiving sibling, right? Or one that's closer to that family dynamic, and it can feel a little bit like they're nitpicking, right? So what's happening here is that maybe they feel insecure about being outside of the bond, right? So this is a way to notice through patterns of relating. And a lot of the time, the sibling caregiver can feel very criticized or picked on or even overwhelmed by the other sibling because there's this perception that they're in a more bonded relationship, right? So it's like, I want to do more for mom, but I'm in a different state. And so I'm kind of jealous of that response, that bond that they have. And so I'm going to try to interject myself, but it just kind of comes off as nitpicking or, kind of clueless sometimes. Like, you're not here every day. You don't know what I need. You don't know what's going on, but then you have all these solutions, kind of a thing, right? And another theme is when a caregiver is a spouse and maybe the adult children um, may not clearly see the relationship in their parents or the relationship dynamics in their parents' marriage, right? So this is partially because their own relationship with their parents, right? The bond and the breathing room that they provide for their parents kind of dominates their experience. So everyone in a family has their own narrative, and a lot of time there's these dynamics in the marriage that the adult children don't know about, right? And so not everyone is telling the same story about it, and it can make things a lot more challenging. And then the final theme I want to talk about is that of the primary caregiver is a spouse. They may have less bond to offer their adult children, okay, or their close friends or family because of what they're offering day to day to their loved one, right? Remember I was saying before that you used to be able to do A, B, and C for your kids, and now you can't because you have to do all this stuff for your spouse because they're in a space where they can't care for themselves. And so then you feel guilty. And maybe some of those kids are feeling like, you're not giving enough to us too, right? And so those are some very challenging themes that we find in caregiving families. And this is why, again, boundary work is so important because you cannot keep hopping back and forth between everybody's needs and neglecting your own, okay? You're gonna crash and burn. So what are some tips we can do? Check your boundaries, right? Um, have a sense of your boundary, right? Make sure you're self-attuned throughout the day, right? Doesn't mean that you have to withdraw your attention from other people. It's just adding the idea of paying a little bit more attention to yourself, right? How am I doing? How am I feeling? Did I eat? Did I get enough water today, right? Did I do anything that made me laugh today, right? That kind of thing. And just try to even just decipher what are your needs, right? If you've been operating in a space of vague boundaries your whole life, you might not even know what those are, okay? So just setting aside that time, even if it's just, while you're washing dishes or, vacuuming or doing something, just kind of let your mind wander. It's like, what would I need to feel restored? What would I need to feel balanced, okay? And you can just start right there. It's just something very simple. Um, just remind yourself it's okay to have boundaries. It's okay to not constantly agree to give and pour your energy out all the time. Okay. Offer yourself breathing room. Okay. Again, breathing room is that element that we don't get a lot of in caregiving. Sometimes you're not getting enough bond either, but a lot of time it's that dynamic where caregiving is very overwhelming and that breathing room is what you need. Like, I just need a break. I just need to step away for a minute. Okay. And so when we use self-compassion, you can notice that your need for breathing room as well as bond. Okay. And so that might look like silence, right? Or something that doesn't help anybody else. It's just for you. It's not interesting to anyone else. It's just for you. Okay. That could be your breathing room. Notice when thoughts or feelings arise for you when you need that need for space, right? Um, are you feeling guilty that you need a break? Are you feeling angry that you haven't gotten one, right? So let's make it normal, right? Let's normalize that breathing room is fundamental, okay? It is as fundamental as bond, okay? We need breathing room as much as we need bond. And in fact, sometimes when our bond need is met, that's when we have that need for breathing room arise in us, right? So you can gently coach yourself into normalizing the need for breathing room as well as bond, and then begin to connect times of irritation and anger or despair to the absence of breathing room, right? I can tell I'm on edge because I haven't had a break, right? I can tell that I'm, feeling more apathetic because I haven't socialized in a while, right? Again, self-attunement, being aware about what you need, what's going on in your own internal world, okay? And then the third thing is to notice and name inundation. Notice when you're feeling overwhelmed. Name that you're feeling overwhelmed and don't feel guilty about that, right? Again, this is normal, okay? You cannot provide care and bond for people all the time and not turn it back to yourself sometimes, okay? You're gonna get overwhelmed. And when you feel those feelings, that's when you know you're getting out of balance, right? That's when you know you've been giving 80% over and over and over again. You need to come back to 50, okay? And 50 is kind of that neutral boundary space, right? Where you're not so closed off, you can't stand to be around nobody, but then you're not just this, hemorrhaging vessel of giving and giving and giving either, right? You're kind of in that neutral space. Next, make your boundary visible, okay? So you can do this by visualization. You could even draw a picture, draw a circle on a piece of paper, and you just draw a circle, right? Or think of a circle. And inside that circle, place all the things that you are responsible for, right? What's in your boundary. And then outside of the circle, imagine or write what you're not responsible for. Okay, this is outside of your boundary. Okay, so think about it this way. If you have a circle around you and someone outside your boundary is angry or they're upset, right? That can produce a feeling of discomfort or unsafety. And a lot of times we think, well, if I can get that guy to stop being mad, then I don't have to feel these feelings, right? But when you're trying to change what's outside of the boundary, a lot of the time you're working too hard, right? Think of it like being on a hamster wheel, and like you're gonna have to be doing that forever and ever and ever, right? Just you're not going anywhere, you're just spinning your wheels, right? But what you can do with self-attunement is say, okay, I need to meet myself in this feeling. You can say it's very hard for me when this person is angry, and so maybe once we meet our own feeling, then we might need to communicate with this person about the impact of their behavior, right? Instead of rushing to fix it and to appease them, we can say, your anger is your issue and it makes me feel this way. And so maybe we can address how we communicate about that a little bit more. Okay. But their behavior is not in your boundary. It's not under your control and you're not responsible for it. Okay. Another thing that you can do is just kind of do a little scan of your boundary, right? And kind of think of it like when you're gardening, right? You see a little weed and you're like, well, how did you get in there? That's not where you're supposed to be. And you just kind of pull it out and toss it, right? It doesn't belong in there. You just pick it up and you put it back outside your boundary, right? Now, of course, if somebody's angry with you and that's something you need to address and they need to, have that conversation with you, that's fine. I'm not saying to ignore when other people are upset with you, but sometimes people are upset and it has nothing to do with you. Okay. And we don't need to be so quick to rush to fix something in somebody else. Okay. That's what boundary practice is. I acknowledge you're upset and I also acknowledge that that's your responsibility. Right. Okay. Hope that makes sense. And then finally, the last piece, back to the theme of guilt, which is a big one. The neutralizing of guilt, okay? I don't think that we can avoid guilt, right? It's part of the dynamic of caregiving, but we can take it down a notch. We can neutralize it And again, guilt is a poor motivator, right? Because it can lead you into having more vague boundaries. Well, I don't want this person upset with me, so I'm going to go and push myself further, right? I don't want this person to disconnect or lose connection with this person. And so I'm going to abandon myself to meet them where they are. Okay. That's vague boundaries. And guilt is often the motivator of doing more than we wish we want to do, right? It prevents us from saying no. Okay. And so you might say yes just so you don't have to feel guilty about something, right? But you can meet this feeling of guilt with the simple phrase, I'm not bad and I haven't done anything wrong. And that's an easy thing to say, but it can also be a very difficult thing to say, right? But it's a very powerful phrase to say to yourself when you start feeling guilty. I'm not bad and I haven't done anything wrong. Okay. Just because someone is upset with us, someone is angry, or someone else is making us do something, even if we don't do that thing, we aren't bad and you haven't done anything wrong. Okay. It's not your job to continuously prove over and over and over again that you're a good person. Okay. You're already a good person. Um, Other people can have a different opinion outside of your boundaries. They will always invite you to feel guilty, but that doesn't mean you have to accept that invitation all the time, right? You can decline them. And in fact, I'm going to suggest that you must decline them most of the time if you're going to make your caregiving sustainable. And that's really what boundary practice for caregivers is. How can I make sure that I'm meeting my needs in this so that I can sustain the care that I'm giving to somebody else? Okay. When you feel less guilty, you're also going to feel less resentment. Okay, so if you can neutralize even some of the feelings that of guilt that you have by meeting them with that phrase, I'm not bad and I haven't done anything wrong, you can feel less resentment as well. Because when you do things to avoid feeling guilty, you're just setting yourself up for future resentment, right? I wanted to say no and I didn't, and now I don't feel guilty, but now I feel angry about it. Okay. So you have the right to feel good about yourself, even when you don't do everything right, right? There's no such thing as a perfect caregiver. Okay. Um, what does it mean, or what does it look like to be doing caregiving right? Right. A lot of us can feel like we're doing caregiving wrong because of the dynamics or the feedback that we get from other people on any given day. Sometimes from the person that is receiving care, but you have the right to feel like a good person, right? And like you have a boundary and a separate sense of self, even when other people don't feel like you're doing everything right. Okay. It's a very hard thing to do, and there's no perfection in caregiving. But with boundary practice, you can do the best that you can for your loved one as well as yourself. So here are my sources if you're interested in doing any more research on your own about boundaries. And I'll go ahead and stop my share. And we're a little bit over